Welcome to Volume 5 in the series, South Pender Pioneer Families, with Janet White, recounting the Jennens family history. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and important history of South Pender Pioneer families and their connection to S DÁYES, South Pender Island, and the surrounding Salish Sea. Janet, daughter of Geoff and Hope Jennens, will speak about her family's experience of living on South Pender Island. Janet and her sister Josephine had the very unique experience of being raised on South Pender Island during the 1940s and 50s. Janet will share stories about their experiences growing up on the island, as well as speak about her parents' farming activities, her dad working as a logger on the island, the education that the girls received, and so much more. This recording was made in December of 2023 in Victoria and is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Historical Society. I'm your host, Chris Wakaluk, and it is my pleasure to present this series to you. My voice has been extracted from this final audio in order to give maximum time and clarity to the interviewee to communicate and share their stories. Thank you for listening. Now here is Janet White sharing the Jennens family story.
I am Janet White. I originally was Janet Jennens, brought up on South Pender Island. Geoff and Hope Jennens were my parents. Hope was Lilia Spalding's granddaughter, and she spent a good lot of her childhood on South Pender. I do remember Lilia Spalding, my great-grandmother. She was a lovely lady. I do not remember her in her original home. However, I remember her when she moved into her daughter's home, which would have been Helen Walker's home. Hope left the island as a young woman and went and lived in Vernon for a time, and then she met Geoff, and they ended up getting married in Vernon and settling on South Pender, where they spent many years from 1941 until 1981. When Geoff came down to South Pender, Christmas Day 1941, Hope had already arrived with her first daughter and was living at what was Higgs's house. And at that time, she was advised by her great aunts to move. There was, of course, the war going on, and the war had not started with the Japanese. However, they were very close to the coast, and everybody knew that. And so, with the advice from her aunt, she left the coastline and went to live with her grandmother. And as we know from history, then Pearl Harbor happened, and she remained with her grandmother until her husband came down on Christmas Day and brought all his animals, and they settled back down into the Higgs house, where they stayed till I was born. And at that time, Hope went to Victoria to have me, and when she returned home in a terrific snowstorm, Geoff met her at Bedwell Harbor, and prior to meeting her there, she had already come over on probably the Mary and got off at Port Washington, gone across Pender in a taxi and to the government wharf at Browning Harbor and been picked up in a small motorboat, and Geoff met her at Bedwell Harbor with a team of horses and a wagon, and so I was taken back to the house they had rented in Johnny's Field, which at that time belonged to the Aldridges, and a few years later they bought it. We lived in that home until 1952, when they built their big log house at Cancod, and that had been underway for some time. It took a long time to finish it, but we lived in it while it was being finished. To this day, it still stands and is owned by the McMullins. I always thought Mom got off the CPR boat right at Bedwell Harbor. And then all those years, and then I discovered, no, my God, she got off at Port Washington, went across the island in a taxi and got into a little motorboat, and then ended up down there. And then I went home in the wagon. No wonder I'm always cold. I probably never recovered. I don't know. So I was glad I actually found out. But you just assume things, and nobody ever told me any different until not too long ago, I guess, before Mom passed away. The first home I lived in on South Pender, we called it Johnny's Field, and it was a small log house. The outside was log, the inside had been finished off. The logs had been covered over. It consisted of one large room from kitchen to dining room, and at one point it was one end we turned into bedrooms when I was very small, and as I got older there was a cabin right next door to it with a breezeway, and we had a heater, and that's where my sister and I slept. And prior to that there was, as I said, the kitchen and a little living room and one bedroom at the end of that. And the living room looked down onto part of the farm, and the end of the kitchen looked across the fields and up towards the barn. There was a vegetable garden out in front, and at one time there was a pen that had pigs in, and that's where they lived, and the barn, which my dad added on to, was where all the sheep were. We stayed there until 1952. Unfortunately, that home burnt down in the 70s, I believe it was. Somebody had lit a fire and left it, and the wind got up that night and set the house on fire. That was the end of the house. Farming wasn't very lucrative, but however, that was part of the way Hope and Geoff made their living. Hope helped out a lot when she could on the farm, but with two little children, there wasn't a lot she could do when they were that young. But Geoff also did a lot of logging and was away quite often during the week, and Hope was home alone, but it certainly added to their income, which would have been very necessary. Also, in those days, people could work on the government road to pay off their taxes, and so that would have been a great help financially. I do believe my dad did and would have been paid for. And also, prior to 1955, when the bridge went in, my dad worked on the road that went from where Spaldings are now to where the bridge is, and making the road, and that would have been a nice income at that time, as well as the farm. My dad would go logging for the week, his 5 days, and then he would come home on the weekend. Due to logging on the island, there were many logging roads, and they were kind of fun sometimes because in the winter, when it was snowy, we used them to sleigh ride on. We had some really good runs doing that. And there was also another spot where the logging road had flattened out the land a lot and made a big pond, and that was great for skating on. So they were good things about them, and unfortunately there was one very bad thing about the logging roads. It spread gorse, and you will find gorse all over the island now, and it's very, very hard to get rid of. It's very beautiful and smells nice, but not a good thing to have spread around. And that's what happened. It got caught in the tracks of the caterpillars when they were logging. So that's how all the gorse got all over the place. One of the unfortunate events that happened in my early childhood was the fact that we were off to go on a nice outing, and we had a tractor and a trailer that we used to get about in at that time. And my mother, sister, and myself were sitting in the trailer, and Dad was driving the tractor. And as we went down a hill, the steering went on the tractor, and we went over the cliff, and my dad was hurt quite badly. His leg was broken very badly and stuck between the tractor and a stump. And fortunately, my mother, sister, and I were all right. I do remember rolling down under the wagon. Fortunately, we managed to get up, and my mother must have helped my dad get out of the predicament he was in, and she went to get help, and there was a lady on the island at that time, Mrs. Craddock. She was the only person with a car, and I would think probably my mother went down to the Conry's house, which is quite close to where the fire hall is now, and she was able to phone, and Mrs. Craddock would have come and got my dad, and they managed to get a boat to come into Bedwa Harbor and take Dad to the hospital at Rest Haven, where he remained for some time recovering. And unfortunately, that injury stayed with him the rest of his life. However, he was very determined, and he returned to his family and farm as soon as he could, which was really far too soon. And the healing process was never really allowed to take place as it should have, which was very unfortunate for him. But he continued on and enjoyed life, and his farming was his love of life, which he was able to do. But that accident certainly had a bad influence on the rest of his life. When he grew up in England, I think that that's what he had always dreamt, that he would have his own farm. And he enjoyed animals, and he was a very hard worker and was willing to do that. And he enjoyed his animals. Some people have animals and they beat them and they're horrible to them. My dad didn't have a bone in his body to be cruel to animals. There were people on the island that were not very kind to their animals. And I think that working for oneself is something that probably most people would like to do, and to be able to do it in something that you really like is a wonderful thing. And you're willing to work very hard at it, and that's the reward you get, I guess, for being happy with what you're doing. And my mom, she helped out on the farm a lot when she could, especially at lambing time. There was lots to do and the lambs to look after. And actually, we all helped with the sheep, rounding them up and bringing them in. And when it came time for dipping them and doing various things, tailing, we all pretty much took part in it. So my mom was a great help to my dad, but she also had her own interests, which was nice for her. She did enjoy sewing and managed to do some of that for herself and for my sister and I. And in the summertime, she often took us onto the beaches at low tide and enjoyed doing that and investigating all the sea life, which was great. And in the wintertime, we used to go what we call beach combing, and we would frequently go to the beaches and see what had washed up, which was nice. And as life got easier for my mom, and there wasn't as much work that she really had to do to help on the farm with cows and chickens and the sheep, she took up pottery, and she became quite a potter, and that was really when my sister and I went away to school. And she really enjoyed that, and it was a great outlet for her. So it was nice for her, and she did a lot of pottery, and she had her own kiln and her wheel, and that was good. We had a very old gas lantern that we hung from the ceiling. It had a couple of mantles hanging from it. It was an ugly thing, so they just hung off that, and then there was the base of it where you put the gas, and then there was a tube, and it went up, and the mantles were there, and we hung that up, and it gave a good light. I can't picture anybody else that had one quite like it. And then I think we got what we called the morning glory, and it was what people use for camping now, a big Coleman light. It was big with the glass on the bottom. It's just what people use camping now. And then we use coal oil lamps, the one with the glass bases. And then if we needed to have a light at night and go anywhere, we had lanterns that you could take outside. They had a really good globe around them, and yeah, so you could take them out in a storm or whatever. Yeah. But we didn't use flashlights. I mean, we had flashlights, but you don't want to, burn your batteries down. They cost a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of money. So the house was bright enough, and we pretty much lived in the kitchen in both houses anyway. In the house at Cape Cod, we had a cook stove and a big heater. And then eventually they built the fireplace in the living room, but that wasn't there for some time, so the house was quite cold. But the kitchen stayed warm because it was a great huge heater. I mean, you walked in the door and the heater was here. It was a big room. It was a big kitchen, but the heater was here. And then the other end, there was a cook stove. So the kitchen stayed warm. But the rest of the house was pretty cold. There was no other heating. This is the house at Cape Cod, the big log house. And the house, Johnny's Field by the farm, it had a cook stove, and there was a heater in the living room. And that was it for the house, too. And then when my sister and I lived in the little cabin on the side, or stayed in it, we had a small heater in there. And we used to light that at night and warm the place up. So maybe just a little word about my early education, which was really rather involved in many weird ways. Probably my first year in grade 1, I did at home with my mom, and my sister already was a couple of years ahead of me in school, and she really did enjoy her schoolwork. And I think probably I was more interested in a lot of other things, maybe even going out and feeding the lambs or something like that. But grade 1 at home, and then grade 2, I believe, was the year we had a lady, Mrs. Landman, come to the school, and there would have been 3 other children that were there, and that lasted a few months, and she helped us with our lessons, and it was a good experience. It was nice, and then after she left, we would have finished off that year at home again, and then we had a gentleman called Mr. Wellbanks, and he rented a cottage, and he taught us, and there was another girl had come to the island then, and so I believe there were 3 of us that Mr. Wellbanks taught in the little cottage. And the following year, I do believe, for 2 years, we went over the mountain every morning. We walked over past Camp Bay and up the valley to the bottom of what was the Spalding farm at one time where she lived, and she taught us along with our correspondence lessons. And she had been a teacher at one time, and she was a fine lady, and she taught us some cooking and sewing and art. She was very much into art and really helped us try to become little artists. And then after that year, I pretty much spent a year at home again with my mother helping us. I don't think it was very great for her. I wasn't really interested in the lessons very much. And then for time, we had a young lady come and try to help my sister and I. And we got through that year, and the following year, I went off to Queen Margaret's in Duncan. So that was for grade 7. And then grade 8, I went and stayed with some relatives in Nanaimo, and I spent a year in Nanaimo. That was a happy year. The following year, I went to Salt Spring Island, and actually my mom rented a little cottage there, and she and my sister were there with me, and that was the year my sister graduated. And after that, for my last 2 years of school, I went and I lived in about, I guess, 3 different places in Esquimalt. I did finish grade 11, and then I decided it was time to go to work. So off to Vancouver and Banff and Calgary and Vancouver, and then eventually I decided perhaps I'd come back to Victoria, and I have remained in Victoria since then, and that would have been 1963. That was my education. I spent a lot of time by myself too, actually. On the road between our place and Bedwell, I found this like a cave, and I used to go up there and spend a lot of time. And I used to have a little fire, and I'd take a pot and water and make myself some macaroni and whatever. And I entertained myself a fair bit. So, and my grandmother lived on South Pender too, and we did a lot of things with her, which was nice. She taught us card games. And she just, in general, she was a pretty great lady, and she had time, and we spent quite a bit of time with her, so that was nice. She was B. Freeman, and prior to that, she was Lilia Spalding's daughter. She was a very outgoing and special person, and she'd always done her own thing, basically. She drove long before other women were driving, and during the war, she'd started a ladies' group in Vernon and that went overseas, but her husband was her second husband. He wasn't well, so she couldn't join them, which was too bad. And then they came and lived at South Pender, and then he died, and then she ended up marrying John Freeman. And he was a wonderful person, and they were together, and we spent a lot of time with our grandmother, in the evenings, and she had time and enjoyed games. And at Christmas, we did baking with her, and she came on our beachcombing expeditions and I guess make Christmas cards with us. And ever so many people her age didn't drive and didn't wear slacks and, were all wearing their dresses and fancy hats and whatever. And she just was a little different. And she enjoyed hunting, which was fine. And when she was in the interior and on the island, and I guess out of the 4 sisters, she was a tomboy, or 3 sisters. But she was a pretty remarkable lady, really. And we used to go down there and play canasta and poker. My mom and dad didn't play cards, and that's fine. By the time their day was done, they were they were exhausted anyway. I never had a summer job because I went home in the summer and I helped at home. And there's one summer I remember particularly, and it was probably the summer of 1958. And my dad was busy getting the water from Greenburn Lake down to the farm, and I was able to help him. And that was quite a job, and I think it set records for heat that summer. It was a very, very hot summer. We were laying pipe from the south end of Greenburn Lake, which had been flooded, to get the water a little closer to send down the mountain. We had these very heavy, heavy pipes to lay. I would think they were probably about 20 feet long and about 80 pounds. So between the 2 of us, we got them down the side of the mountain that summer. And that is something that always stays with me. It was hard work, but on the other hand, it was fun and very satisfying when it was done. And my dad had a big pond dug at the bottom of the mountain. And that was wonderful. It got filled up with water, and we were able to swim in it, which for me was really nice, but I love swimming. And I had begun to find the ocean rather cold to swim in. When I was younger, I could spend a lot of time in it, but not so much then. So this pond was wonderful. And it was nice to be able to help my dad on the farm. I enjoyed it. And he was a person who felt that young people really shouldn't have summer jobs. They should just be able to enjoy their summers off from school. They grow up fast enough, was his theory. My sister kept herself busy, but she much preferred to do things with my mom around the house and keep busy in that manner. In the summers, there were always kids came to the island for holidays. And so we got to know them. Sometimes we came into Victoria and stayed with some of them. And we used to go in the summer to Britannia Beach, and I stayed at my cousin's there. And we used to go to Vancouver and a few times and stay with friends there in the summer. And I never had a problem fitting in, and I never felt that I was that different. I mean, I knew that my life was different, but it never bothered me. And when I lived in Nanaimo, the relatives I lived with were really well off, but that was just, they were well off, and that was just the way it was. And it didn't impress me, or I didn't envy them. They treated me well, and I had an opportunity to live there and go to school. And actually, their daughter was in the same grade, and they opened a new school on the other side of Nanaimo, and we lived in Cedar, and they needed students for the school, and we were bused right from Cedar, which is almost at Yellow Point, if you know the area. We were bused right across town out to the far side of Nanaimo to go to school. So I lived there, and then when I lived in Victoria, I lived with people and worked for my room and board first, and then I boarded for a while, and then I spent another year looking after kids. But I fit into the family. The population of South Pender was very minimal when I was very young. I can count up to 17 people when I was maybe in the range of 5 to 7, and prior to that even there were far less. Our closest neighbor would have been the Conrys, living a good hour's walk down the road to almost down to Bedwell Harbor. And so it was quite restricted, but as time went by, more people came to the island. But for many years, population did not grow much over 17 people. The time had come for Hope and Geoff to think about maybe scaling back the farm a bit and not retiring, but trying to cut back on so much work. So what were they going to do? Well, they put their property on the market, 2 different parcels. There was the Greenburn Lake property and there was the Cancod property. So it was a matter of which one went first, then that would be gone. They would live on the one left. So as it turned out, Cancod, the beachfront property, went first. So they had never really had a holiday together. So what they decided to do was, after they sold, instead of settling in and building a house at Greenburn right away, they set up a little camp across the far side of the lake, which would have been the south side. And they camped there for the summer, and they had their grandchildren come, and they had actually a wonderful summer there. And in the fall, they went on the Oriana, and they had their trip of a lifetime. They went off and they went to Australia and had a wonderful time visiting friends and relations there, and stopped in New Zealand on their way home and spent a couple of months there enjoying life. And they came back in the spring and they got busy and they had their panabode delivered up to Greenburn Lake. We have some marvelous pictures of it being towed up. And then it was time for the family all to pitch in and help build the panabode house. And that was a good fun time for all the family. And then we come and go across the lake in a little boat, or otherwise we'd drive around, but mostly we would come and go across the lake in the boat to their little camp. And it wasn't long before the panabode was finished, and it was time for them to get a few animals again. So they did get some cows and a few sheep, and that was nice. They enjoyed that. And my dad put in a garden at the bottom of the property as you come up from Bedwell Harbor that was very productive. And actually, at one time, Mr. Richardson, one of the first settlers on the island, had a garden there. So many years before, it had been used, and it was fairly easy to make a new garden there. And they cleared and blasted a bit of the meadow down there that would have been quite productive, but unfortunately, before all the plans could take place, my dad had a stroke and was unable to fulfill all the many things he had hoped to do. So he spent 4 years in a wheelchair before he passed away, and the family all helped as much as they could, and he came and went from the island as his wife looked after him and the animals, which eventually she did have to get rid of. And in 1981, the property was sold, and that was the end of the Jennens family's history on the island. I think growing up on the island was, to quite a degree, such a different life than other children my age. We had a number of young children come to the island for their holidays in the summer, and we certainly had a good time with them, and sometimes we would be invited back to their homes, and that would be very nice, but we would have to get there on our own and at a very young age, and I think that probably helped to give me some independence, and going to stay with families that you didn't know all of them, or your way around where you were, and in different instances having to travel on various different transportation. As an example, going to Britannia Beach, having to go to Vancouver, though we were met by an uncle, but then put on another boat to go to Britannia and met there, and having to come back on our own and back to the island. And that would have been at a very young age. I think I was 9 at that time. And my trips to Victoria to stay with friends, we pretty much had to come and go on our own. And when I went away to school, my first trips to Duncan, I was taken there. After that, I came and went on the public bus, and sometimes had to spend a night in Victoria and make my way to my friend's house on that evening and go home the next day by various transportation. And as time went by and I went to high school in Victoria, I stayed with different families, and I had to come and go on my own and fit into their lives, and in some cases look after their children at a very young age, and find myself in situations where if one of them got injured, well, it was up to me to either get an ambulance or get somebody to come and help them. And I just had to be independent, and in those cases, look after whatever came up. And having lived with other people than family, you have to learn to fit in. And it's not always easy, but if you're willing to, then it's not such a hard job. And I think school is another thing that maybe sometimes it's not that easy for some people to fit in, but if you just know who you are and make up your mind you do what you think is the right thing to do, then that's all right. I wanted to add that my parents' farm on South Pender brought so many happy memories to their grandkids and many other people. My kids have so many special memories of South Pender, from bottle feeding the lambs, riding the ponies, lighting pitch trees, having the freedom to just explore, and of course swimming in the lake. Each of my kids would go alone and spend weekends at the lake with Mom and Dad. Mom would always have something special for them to do, building fairy forts or finding a special place on a hill to start a fire and roast hot dogs. Those are just a few things. Luckily, my 7 grandkids have got to spend some time on South Pender and learn about the Jennens history on the island. Even now, I run into old friends that always talk about the special memories they have visiting my parents, Jeff and Hope, on South Pender.
Thank you very much to Janet for doing this interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.